The harsh Wyoming wind cut through Samuel Hayes's worn leather jacket as he guided his horse toward the old trading post. It was late October 1876, and winter was coming fast to the frontier. Samuel had been riding for 3 days straight, driving a small herd of cattle to market in the nearest town. His weathered face showed the strain of years working the unforgiving land, but his blue eyes still held the determination that had brought him west from Missouri 15 years ago. As he approached Miller's trading post, Samuel noticed something unusual near the water trough behind the building. A small figure huddled against the wooden structure, barely visible in the fading afternoon light. At first he thought it might be a lost animal, but as he dismounted and walked closer, he realized it was a child. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His dark hair hung in matted strands around a face that was gaunt with hunger. The child's clothes were little more than rags, and his small body shivered uncontrollably in the cold air. Most striking were his large dark eyes that followed Samuel's every movement with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Samuel recognized immediately that this was a Native American child, likely from one of the local tribes. The relationship between settlers and the indigenous people in this area had been tense for years, with conflicts erupting regularly over land and resources. Many cowboys and ranchers viewed any Native American as a potential threat, but Samuel had always tried to judge people as individuals rather than by their race or tribe. "Hey there, little one," Samuel said softly, crouching down to the child's level. He kept his voice gentle and moved slowly, not wanting to frighten the boy further. "Are you hurt?" The child's eyes widened, and he pressed himself further against the wooden trough. He didn't speak, but Samuel could see the exhaustion and hunger written plainly across his small features. The boy's lips were cracked and dry, and his cheeks were hollow from lack of food. Samuel's heart went out to the child. He had seen enough suffering on the frontier to recognize desperation when he saw it. Without hesitation, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of dried beef in his water canteen. The boy's eyes followed the food with intense focus, but he remained motionless, as if afraid that any movement might make this potential salvation disappear. "It's okay," Samuel said, setting the food and water on the ground between them. "Go ahead and eat. You look like you need it more than I do." The child stared at the offering for a long moment, then slowly reached out with trembling hands. He grabbed the dried meat and began eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Samuel watched as the boy drank deeply from the canteen, water running down his chin as he gulped it down. While the child ate, Samuel studied his surroundings more carefully. There were no signs of other people, no horses or belongings that might indicate where the boy had come from or how he had ended up alone at this remote trading post. The nearest Native American settlement was at least 20 miles away, through difficult terrain that would be challenging even for an adult. "Where's your family, son?" Samuel asked gently, though he didn't expect an answer. The boy either didn't understand English or was too frightened to speak. As the child finished eating, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were old bruises on the boy's arms and what looked like rope burns around his wrists. Someone had tied this child up, and from the looks of it, he had escaped or been abandoned. The implications were disturbing, and Samuel felt a surge of anger at whoever had mistreated such a young, defenseless person. The sun was beginning to set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Samuel knew he couldn't leave the child here overnight. The frontier was dangerous enough for armed adults. A young boy alone would not survive the night, especially with wolves and other predators common in the area. "Listen," Samuel said, standing up slowly. "I've got a place not far from here. It's warm, and there's more food. You can stay there tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you back to your people." The boy looked up at him with those large, dark eyes, and Samuel saw a flicker of understanding. Whether the child spoke English or simply recognized the kindness in Samuel's tone, he seemed to realize that this strange cowboy meant him no harm. Samuel helped the boy to his feet, noting how thin and weak he was. The child could barely stand on his own, and Samuel had to support him as they walked toward his horse. The boy had clearly been through an ordeal that no child should ever have to endure. As they rode toward Samuel's small ranch, the cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was going to change his life somehow. He had always been a solitary man, content with his cattle and his simple existence on the frontier. But something about this vulnerable child had touched a part of his heart that he thought had been hardened by years of frontier life. The boy rode in front of Samuel, wrapped in the cowboy's spare blanket. Despite his exhaustion, the child remained alert, his head turning at every sound in the growing darkness. Samuel could feel the tension in the small body pressed against his chest, and he spoke softly to reassure the boy as they traveled through the night. Samuel's ranch was modest but sturdy, consisting of a small log cabin, a barn, and a corral for his horses. He had built it all himself over the years, creating a refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. As they approached the property, Samuel felt a sense of pride in what he had accomplished, but also a new awareness of how lonely his existence had become. Inside the warm cabin, Samuel prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread while the boy sat by the fireplace, soaking up the heat. The child's eyes never left Samuel, watching his every movement with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. As the night wore on, Samuel began to understand that this encounter was about more than just helping a lost child. Something significant was about to unfold, though he had no idea what challenges the coming dawn would bring. Samuel woke before dawn to the sound of his horses moving restlessly in the corral. Years of frontier living had trained him to wake at the slightest unusual sound, and something was definitely not right. The child was still sleeping peacefully on the makeshift bed Samuel had prepared near the fireplace, wrapped in warm blankets and looking more peaceful than he had the night before. Moving quietly to avoid waking the boy, Samuel pulled on his boots and grabbed his rifle from above the door. The horses were definitely agitated about something, snorting and pawing the ground in the way they did when predators were near. Samuel had lost cattle to wolves before, and he suspected that might be the cause of the disturbance. As he stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness, Samuel immediately sensed that something was very wrong. The air felt different, charged with a tension he couldn't quite identify. His horses were pressed against the far side of the corral, their ears back and eyes wide with fear. But this wasn't the kind of fear they showed around wolves or bears. This was something else entirely. Samuel's trained eyes scanned the darkness around his property, looking for any sign of movement or threat. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the general outline of his barn, the corral, and the open pasture beyond. Everything appeared normal, but his instincts told him otherwise. After 15 years on the frontier, Samuel had learned to trust those instincts completely. A slight movement near the tree line caught his attention. At first he thought it might be a deer or elk, common in this area. But as he watched more carefully, he realized the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful to be an animal. Someone was out there watching his property. Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle as he considered his options. He could retreat to the cabin and wait until daylight, but that would mean trapping himself and the child inside with no way of escape if trouble came. On the other hand, investigating alone in the darkness could be walking into an ambush. As he stood there weighing his choices, Samuel began to notice more movement in different areas around his property. What he had initially thought was a single person now appeared to be multiple figures positioned at various points around his ranch. The realization sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. Moving as quietly as possible, Samuel made his way to the corner of his cabin, where he could get a better view of the surrounding area. From this position, he could see several dark shapes positioned among the trees and rocks that bordered his property. They weren't moving randomly like animals would. Instead, they appeared to be maintaining specific positions in what looked like a coordinated formation. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. His first thought was that these might be bandits or outlaws planning to rob him, but something about their positioning and behavior didn't fit that pattern. Outlaws typically struck fast and hard, not surrounding a property and waiting in the darkness for hours. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Samuel started to make out more details about the figures surrounding his ranch. What he saw made his blood run cold. These weren't bandits or random troublemakers. These were Native American warriors, and there were far more of them than he had initially realized. From his position, Samuel could count at least 30 figures that he could see clearly, and he suspected there were many more hidden in positions he couldn't observe. They were armed with rifles, bows, and traditional weapons, and they had positioned themselves with the tactical precision of experienced fighters. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to be waiting for something. Samuel's thoughts immediately turned to the child sleeping in his cabin. The boy was clearly Native American, and now Samuel found himself surrounded by what appeared to be a war party. The connection seemed obvious, but Samuel couldn't understand why they were just waiting instead of demanding the boy's return or attacking outright. As more light filled the sky, Samuel could see the warriors more clearly. They were painted for war, with traditional markings and feathers that indicated this was a serious military operation. Their faces were stern and focused, and their weapons were ready for use. Yet they remained motionless, maintaining their positions around the property, without making any aggressive moves. The silence was unnerving. Samuel had been in tense situations before, but nothing quite like this. The warriors weren't calling out demands or making threats. They simply watched and waited, creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to grow thicker with each passing minute. Samuel realized he was facing a decision that could determine whether he lived to see another sunset. He could try to return the boy and hope that would satisfy the warriors, but he had no way of knowing if that was what they wanted, or if they had other plans. He could try to defend his property, but against these numbers and with only his rifle and pistol, that would likely be suicide. As he considered his options, Samuel found himself thinking about the child's condition when he had found him. The bruises and rope burns suggested the boy had been mistreated, possibly even held captive. If these warriors were here to rescue him, Samuel could understand their presence. But if they were responsible for the child's condition in the first place, returning him might not be the right thing to do. The growing daylight revealed even more warriors than Samuel had initially spotted. They seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, emerging from behind rocks, trees, and small hills that Samuel would have sworn were empty just moments before. The tactical skill required to position so many people without detection was impressive and terrifying. Samuel counted at least 50 warriors now, possibly more. They had completely surrounded his property, cutting off any possible escape route. Their positioning was so precise that Samuel realized this operation had been planned carefully, not thrown together in haste. Someone had given considerable thought to how to approach his ranch without being detected. The horses in the corral were becoming increasingly agitated, sensing the presence of so many unfamiliar people around the property. Samuel worried that their noise might wake the child, creating an even more complicated situation. He needed to make a decision soon, before the situation escalated beyond his control. As the sun crested the horizon, Samuel could see the faces of some of the nearest warriors clearly. What he saw there wasn't the bloodthirsty anger he might have expected, but rather a patient determination. These men weren't here for a random raid or attack. They had a specific purpose, and they were prepared to wait as long as necessary to achieve it. The realization that they were waiting for him to make the first move put even more pressure on Samuel. Whatever happened next would likely be triggered by his actions, and he had no way of knowing what response would lead to a peaceful resolution versus a deadly confrontation. Samuel stood frozen at the corner of his cabin, watching as the full scope of the situation became clear in the growing daylight. The number of warriors surrounding his property was far beyond what he had initially imagined. As the morning light revealed more details, he could see that this wasn't just a large group of fighters, but what appeared to be an entire war party numbering close to 200 men. The precision of their positioning was remarkable. Every possible escape route from his property was blocked. Every vantage point was covered, and every strategic advantage had been neutralized. Samuel had to admire the tactical skill involved, even as it terrified him. These warriors had clearly planned this operation with military precision, and they had executed it flawlessly. What struck Samuel most was their patience. In all his years on the frontier, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. Usually, conflicts with Native Americans erupted quickly into violence or were resolved through immediate negotiation. This silent waiting game was unlike anything he had experienced, and it left him feeling off balance and uncertain. Inside the cabin, Samuel could hear the child beginning to stir. The boy would wake up soon, and Samuel had no idea how that would change the dynamics of the situation. Would the child be frightened to see so many warriors? Would he run to them, or would he stay close to Samuel? The uncertainty made everything more complicated. Samuel decided he needed to take some kind of action before the situation escalated further. Keeping his rifle visible but not raised in a threatening manner, he stepped out from behind the cabin and into the open yard. The response from the warriors was immediate and coordinated. Every weapon turned toward him, but none were fired. The message was clear. They were ready for violence but weren't initiating it. "I know you're out there," Samuel called out, his voice carrying across the quiet morning air. "I can see you, and I know you can see me. I'm not looking for trouble, and I hope you aren't either." The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel waited for a response, but none came. The warriors remained motionless in their positions, watching him with the patience of hunters waiting for their prey to make a crucial mistake. Samuel realized that whatever they wanted, they were going to make him figure it out on his own. From his position in the yard, Samuel could see even more warriors than he had spotted from the cabin. They occupied every piece of cover around his property, from the obvious positions in the trees to more creative hiding spots behind his own equipment and buildings. The level of coordination required to position so many people without making a sound was extraordinary. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to understand what these warriors wanted from him. The obvious answer was the child, but something about their behavior suggested there was more to it than a simple rescue operation. If they just wanted the boy back, why not send a small delegation to negotiate? Why bring what appeared to be enough warriors to assault a small town? The sound of the cabin door opening behind him made Samuel's heart skip a beat. He turned to see the child standing in the doorway, wrapped in one of Samuel's blankets and looking out at the scene with wide, dark eyes. The boy's appearance created an immediate stir among the warriors. Samuel could see slight movements and adjustments in their positions, but still, no one made any aggressive moves. The child stepped out of the cabin and walked slowly toward Samuel, his eyes scanning the landscape around the property. Unlike Samuel, the boy didn't seem surprised or frightened by the presence of so many warriors. Instead, there was something almost like recognition in his expression, as if he had been expecting this moment. "Do you know these men?" Samuel asked quietly, not wanting to make any sudden movements that might trigger violence. The boy looked up at Samuel with those large, dark eyes and nodded slowly. Then, to Samuel's surprise, the child began speaking in what Samuel assumed was his native language. The boy's voice was clear and strong, carrying across the yard to the waiting warriors. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the emotion in the child's voice, a mixture of sadness, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The response from the warriors was immediate and dramatic. What had been perfect silence was suddenly filled with low murmurs and conversations in the native language. Samuel could see warriors exchanging glances and gestures, as if the child's words had conveyed information that changed everything about the situation. One of the warriors, an older man with distinctive markings and feathers that suggested a position of authority, stepped out from behind a large boulder about 50 yards away. He walked toward Samuel and the child with measured, deliberate steps, his rifle held low but ready. As he approached, Samuel could see the weathered face of a man who had seen many battles and many hardships. The warrior stopped about 20 feet away from Samuel and spoke directly to the child in their native language. The conversation that followed was intense and emotional, with the child speaking rapidly and gesturing toward Samuel several times. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could sense that the boy was telling the story of what had happened, how Samuel had found him and cared for him. During this conversation, Samuel noticed something that surprised him. The warrior's eyes kept moving to Samuel, studying him with an intensity that went beyond simple curiosity. There was something almost like respect in the man's gaze, as if the child's words were painting Samuel in a favorable light. When the child finished speaking, the warrior turned his full attention to Samuel. For a long moment, the two men studied each other across the cultural and linguistic divide that separated them. Samuel could feel the weight of not just this one man's judgment, but the collective attention of all the warriors surrounding his property. "You helped him," the warrior said in heavily accented but clear English, surprising Samuel with his ability to speak the language. "He was starving," Samuel replied simply. "Anyone would have done the same." The warrior's expression remained stern, but Samuel thought he detected a slight softening around the man's eyes. "Not anyone," the warrior said. "Most of your people would have left him to die or worse." Samuel felt a chill at the implication of those words. "What happened to him? Where did he come from?" The warrior was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "He was taken from our village 3 weeks ago." stolen by men who thought to sell him to work in the mines. He escaped 2 days ago and has been running ever since. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place for Samuel. The bruises, the rope burns, the exhaustion and terror he had seen in the child's eyes. All of it made sense now. The boy had been kidnapped and was being trafficked as slave labor, a practice that Samuel knew existed on the frontier but had hoped never to encounter directly. "I had no idea," Samuel said, looking down at the child with new understanding. "I just saw a hungry boy who needed help." The warrior nodded slowly. "The boy has told me what you did for him. You fed him, gave him shelter, and asked for nothing in return. This is not what we expected from your people." Samuel began to understand why so many warriors had surrounded his property. They hadn't come for a simple rescue operation. They had come expecting a fight, prepared to face whoever had been responsible for the child's suffering. The size of the war party made sense now. It was a show of force designed to overwhelm any resistance they might encounter. The warrior leader, who had introduced himself as Chief Running Bear, gestured for Samuel to sit on a large log near his cabin. The morning sun was now fully up, casting long shadows across the yard where this unprecedented meeting was taking place. Samuel could hardly believe he was having a peaceful conversation while surrounded by 200 armed warriors, but the chief's calm demeanor was helping to ease the tension. "My name is Samuel Hayes," the cowboy said, extending his hand in the traditional white man's greeting. After a moment's hesitation, Chief Running Bear clasped his hand firmly, a gesture that seemed to carry great significance. "I know your name," the chief replied, surprising Samuel. "We have been watching you for some time, Samuel Hayes. We know you are different from the other settlers in this area." Samuel felt a mixture of curiosity and concern at this revelation. "You've been watching me? Why?" Chief Running Bear settled himself on another log while the child, whose name Samuel learned was Little Wolf, sat between them. The boy seemed completely comfortable now, as if the presence of so many warriors was the most natural thing in the world. "3 months ago, you found our horses that had strayed from our herd," the chief began. "Instead of keeping them as many of your people would have done, you drove them back to the boundary of our territory and left them where we could find them. You asked for no payment, no reward." Samuel remembered the incident clearly. He had found 6 horses bearing tribal markings wandering on his land, and it had seemed only right to return them. "They weren't mine to keep," he said simply. 2 months before that," the chief continued, "you came upon our hunting party when one of our young men had been injured by a bear. You could have ridden away, pretended not to see us. Instead, you helped us get him to safety, even though it meant traveling far from your own territory." Samuel nodded, remembering that day as well. The young hunter had been badly mauled, and Samuel's knowledge of frontier medicine had helped save the man's life. He would have died if someone hadn't helped. It seemed like the right thing to do. Chief Running Bear studied Samuel's face intently. "The right thing to do. This is not a phrase we hear often from your people when speaking of ours. Most settlers see us only as obstacles to their expansion, enemies to be eliminated or driven away." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the group of warriors positioned near the tree line. Several men were emerging from the forest, but these weren't part of the original war party. They were escorting 3 white men whose hands were bound behind their backs. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that these prisoners were in rough condition, their clothes torn and their faces showing signs of rough treatment. "Ah," said Chief Running Bear, standing as the group approached. "It seems our other mission has been successful as well." Samuel watched as the prisoners were brought into the yard. He didn't recognize any of them, but their appearance suggested they were the kind of rough men who lived on the edges of frontier society. Their eyes were hard and cruel, and even bound and captured, they radiated a dangerous energy. Little Wolf's reaction to seeing these men was immediate and dramatic. The boy pressed himself against Samuel's side, trembling with fear, his eyes wide with terror. Samuel put a protective arm around the child, feeling the boy's rapid heartbeat against his ribs. "These are the men who took Little Wolf from our village," Chief Running Bear explained, his voice hard with controlled anger. "They have been running a slave operation, stealing children from various tribes and selling them to work in the mines and factories in the territory." Samuel felt a surge of disgust and anger. Child trafficking was one of the most heinous crimes he could imagine, and the fact that it was happening in his area made him feel partly responsible for not knowing about it sooner. One of the prisoners, a tall man with a scraggly beard and cold eyes, spoke up with surprising boldness. "You've got no right to take us prisoner, you savages. We're American citizens, and what we do with these Indian brats is none of your concern." The reaction from the warriors was immediate and threatening. Samuel could see weapons being raised and hear angry murmurs in the native language. Chief Running Bear raised his hand for silence, but his own expression had become dangerous. "You steal children from their families," the chief said, his voice low and controlled but carrying a deadly undertone. "You beat them, starve them, and sell them like animals. You speak of rights while denying the most basic rights to innocent children." Samuel found himself standing up, his own anger overriding his caution. "You're talking about slavery," he said to the prisoners. "That's illegal under federal law, regardless of whether the victims are white, black, or Native American." The bearded man laughed harshly. "Federal law doesn't reach out here, cowboy, and nobody cares what happens to a few Indian kids anyway." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Samuel like a physical blow. He had always known that prejudice and violence existed on the frontier, but to hear it expressed so callously, especially in front of Little Wolf, made his blood boil. Chief Running Bear stepped closer to the prisoners, his hand resting on the handle of his tomahawk. "You are wrong about many things," he said quietly. "People do care what happens to our children, and you are about to learn that there are consequences for your actions." Samuel could sense that the situation was about to take a violent turn. While he had no sympathy for child traffickers, he also didn't want to witness an execution, especially not in front of Little Wolf. The boy had already been through enough trauma without seeing more violence. "Chief Running Bear," Samuel said carefully, "what are you planning to do with these men?" The chief turned to look at Samuel, and there was something unreadable in his expression. "That depends on several things," he said. "It depends on what they have done, what they are willing to confess to, and what kind of justice would best serve our people and the children they have harmed." Samuel realized that he was being drawn into something much larger than just returning a lost child to his family. This was about justice, about protecting vulnerable children, and about the complex relationship between the settlers and the Native American tribes in the territory. The second prisoner, younger than the first but with the same hard eyes, spoke up. "We ain't done nothing that half the territory ain't doing. Indians ain't got the same rights as white folks, and everyone knows it." Little Wolf whimpered and pressed closer to Samuel at the sound of the man's voice. Samuel could feel the child's fear and trauma, and it strengthened his resolve to see that justice was done, whatever form that might take. Chief Running Bear knelt down in front of Little Wolf and spoke to him gently in their native language. The boy responded haltingly, his voice shaking as he apparently recounted his experiences with these men. As the child spoke, Samuel could see the chief's expression growing darker and more dangerous. When Little Wolf finished speaking, Chief Running Bear stood slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. "These men have committed crimes against not just our tribe, but against at least 6 other tribes in the territory. They have stolen dozens of children over the past year. Some of those children we have been able to recover. Others—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Samuel felt sick at the scope of what was being revealed. This wasn't just an isolated incident, but a systematic operation that had been devastating Native American communities across the territory. The fact that it had been going on for so long without interference from federal authorities spoke to the broader injustices facing indigenous peoples. Chief Running Bear walked over to a group of his senior warriors and began speaking in their native language. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could tell from the tone and body language that they were discussing something serious. The fate of the 3 prisoners hung in the balance, and Samuel found himself in the unexpected position of potentially influencing that decision. While the discussion continued, Samuel knelt down beside Little Wolf, who was still clinging to his side. The boy's fear was palpable, and Samuel wanted to provide whatever comfort he could. Speaking softly, he said, "You're safe now. Little Wolf, these bad men can't hurt you anymore." The child looked up at Samuel with those large, dark eyes that had first captured his attention at the trading post. In halting English, Little Wolf whispered, "They said they would come back for me. They said no one could hide from them." Samuel felt a chill at the child's words. The trauma these men had inflicted went far beyond physical abuse. They had terrorized this boy with threats and psychological torture. The anger that Samuel felt toward the prisoners intensified, but he kept his voice calm and reassuring for Little Wolf's sake. "They can't come back for you," Samuel said firmly. "Look around you. Your people came to find you, and they brought enough warriors to handle any threat. You're protected now." Chief Running Bear returned from his discussion with the other warriors, his expression grave but determined. "Samuel Hayes," he said, "I have a question for you, and your answer will help determine what happens here today." Samuel stood up, keeping Little Wolf close beside him. "What do you want to know?" "These men have committed crimes against our people, but they have also committed crimes against your people's laws. In your justice system, what would be the punishment for stealing children and selling them into slavery?" Samuel considered the question carefully. He knew that under federal law, kidnapping and human trafficking were serious felonies that could carry severe penalties, including death in some circumstances. However, he also knew that the reality of frontier justice was often quite different from what the law book said. Under federal law, Samuel said honestly, these crimes would carry lengthy prison sentences, possibly even death. But I have to tell you the truth, Chief Running Bear. Out here on the frontier, white men who commit crimes against Native Americans are rarely prosecuted to the full extent of the law. If they're prosecuted at all. The chief nodded grimly. This is what we expected to hear. It is why we have come in such numbers, and why we must handle this matter ourselves. Samuel felt the weight of the moment. He was being asked to stand witness to frontier justice, and his words might influence whether these men lived or died. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. These were undoubtedly evil men who deserved punishment. But Samuel had always believed in the rule of law, even when that law was imperfectly applied. "What are you planning to do?" Samuel asked. Before Chief Running Bear could answer, one of the prisoners, the youngest of the three, broke down and began speaking rapidly. "Please," he begged, "I didn't want to do it. Marcus there, he forced me into it. Said if I didn't help, he'd kill me. I never hurt any of the kids, I swear on my mother's grave." The bearded man, apparently Marcus, turned on his companion with fury. "Shut your mouth, you coward. Don't give these savages the satisfaction." Chief Running Bear held up his hand for silence, then approached the young prisoner. "What is your name?" he asked. "Billy Carson," the man replied, tears streaming down his face. "I'm only 19. I got mixed up with these men because I needed work, but I never wanted to hurt children." "Tell us what you know," the chief said. "Tell us about the operation, where the children were taken. Who else was involved?" Billy began talking rapidly, providing details about the criminal network that had been operating across the territory. Samuel listened with growing horror as the scope of the operation became clear. There were at least a dozen men involved, with connections to mining operations, factories, and even some legitimate businesses that were using child slave labor. The information Billy provided painted a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation that had been going on for over 2 years. Children from multiple tribes had been targeted, with the criminals specifically choosing victims from isolated communities where their disappearance might not be immediately noticed by federal authorities. As Billy continued his confession, Samuel noticed that Chief Running Bear was carefully memorizing every detail. This wasn't just about punishing these 3 men. It was about gathering intelligence to dismantle the entire network and rescue other children who might still be in captivity. "Where are the children now?" the chief asked. "Most of them are at the Morrison mine, about 50 miles southeast of here," Billy replied. "Some others were sold to a factory operation near Silver Creek. I can give you exact locations, names of the people involved, everything you want to know." Marcus, the bearded leader, finally spoke up again, his voice filled with venom. "You're signing all our death warrants, Billy. These savages are going to kill us no matter what you tell them." Chief Running Bear turned to face Marcus directly. "You speak of death warrants as if they are something new. You have been killing our children with your cruelty and abuse. You have separated families and destroyed lives. What kind of mercy do you think you deserve?" Samuel found himself caught between conflicting emotions. His civilized sensibilities recoiled at the idea of summary execution, but his sense of justice was outraged by the crimes these men had committed. Little Wolf, still pressed against his side, represented all the innocent victims who had suffered at the hands of these criminals. "Chief Running Bear," Samuel said carefully, "I understand your anger and I share it. These men deserve to be punished for what they've done. But killing them won't bring back the children who have already been hurt, and it won't help rescue the ones who are still in captivity. The chief studied Samuel's face intently. "What would you suggest?" Samuel took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could determine the fate of 3 men, regardless of how evil they might be. Samuel looked around at the assembled warriors, then down at Little Wolf, and finally back at Chief Running Bear. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a physical force. 3 lives hung in the balance, and somehow his opinion had become crucial to the decision. "Billy has given you valuable information," Samuel said slowly, choosing his words with great care. "That information could help you save other children who are still suffering. But Marcus and the 3rd man might know even more. Dead men can't provide information about other victims or help identify additional criminals in the network." Chief Running Bear nodded thoughtfully. "You speak wisdom, but you have not lived with the pain of losing children to these men. You have not seen the tears of mothers who will never hold their babies again." Samuel felt the truth of those words hit him hard. He was asking for mercy for men who had shown none to innocent children. Yet something deep inside him rebelled against the idea of execution, even for criminals as despicable as these. "You're right," Samuel admitted. "I haven't experienced that pain, and I can't imagine how terrible it must be. But I've seen what revenge and violence do to people. It changes them, hardens them, and sometimes it makes them become the very thing they're fighting against." Little Wolf suddenly spoke up in English, his young voice cutting through the tension. "They said they would burn our village if anyone came looking for us. They said they had friends who would hurt our families." This new information sent a ripple of anger through the assembled warriors. Samuel could see hands tightening on weapons and faces growing darker with rage. The threat against the entire village elevated the crimes beyond individual kidnapping to an act of war against the tribe. Marcus, apparently realizing that his situation was becoming more desperate by the minute, tried a different approach. "Look here, Chief," he said with false bravado. "We can make a deal. We've got money hidden, quite a bit of it. We can pay compensation for any trouble we've caused." The suggestion that money could compensate for the trauma inflicted on children was so offensive that even Samuel felt his anger spike. Chief Running Bear's expression became deadly calm, which Samuel had learned was far more dangerous than visible rage. "You think our children can be bought and sold like cattle?" the chief said quietly. "You think money can wash away the nightmares you have given them, the fear you have planted in their hearts?" "Now hold on," Marcus protested. "I'm just trying to find a solution that works for everyone here." Chief Running Bear turned away from Marcus in disgust and walked over to another group of warriors. Samuel watched as they engaged in an intense discussion, with several men gesturing emphatically and others nodding grimly. The debate seemed to be passionate but controlled, suggesting that the tribe had established procedures for handling situations like this. While the discussion continued, Samuel noticed that some of the warriors were preparing for departure. They were checking weapons, adjusting equipment, and organizing supplies in a way that suggested they were planning a mission. Samuel realized that regardless of what happened to the 3 prisoners, the information Billy had provided was going to lead to immediate action to rescue the other captive children. "Samuel," Chief Running Bear called, returning from his discussion, "my warriors are preparing to ride to the locations Billy has described. We will rescue the children who are still being held captive. But first, we must decide what to do with these 3 men." Samuel looked at the prisoners again. Billy was still crying and appeared genuinely remorseful, though Samuel knew that remorse often came easily when facing death. Marcus remained defiant and unrepentant, while the 3rd man, who had barely spoken, seemed resigned to whatever fate awaited him. "What would happen to them if you turned them over to federal authorities?" Samuel asked. Chief Running Bear's expression was skeptical. "You know as well as I do what would happen. There would be a trial in a town where half the jury thinks Indian children are not worth protecting. The men would receive light sentences or be acquitted entirely. They would be free to continue their crimes within months." Samuel knew the chief was probably right. The frontier justice system was notoriously biased against Native Americans, and crimes committed against indigenous people were rarely prosecuted with the same vigor as crimes against white settlers. "But if you execute them here," Samuel said, "federal authorities might use that as justification for military action against your tribe. You could be starting a war that would hurt far more of your people than these men ever could." This argument seemed to carry weight with Chief Running Bear. Samuel could see him, considering the broader implications of their actions today. The chief was not just a warrior, but a leader responsible for the safety and future of his entire tribe. Little Wolf tugged on Samuel's shirt and whispered something in his native language. Samuel looked down at the boy, then at Chief Running Bear. "What did he say?" He asked if the bad men will ever stop hurting children, the chief translated. He wants to know if killing them will make other children safe. The innocent question from the child cut to the heart of the matter. This wasn't really about revenge or justice in the abstract. It was about protecting vulnerable children from predators who viewed them as nothing more than commodities to be bought and sold. Samuel knelt down beside Little Wolf and spoke directly to him. "The most important thing is to save the children who are still in danger, and to make sure this never happens again. That means finding all the bad men, not just these 3. Chief Running Bear watched this exchange with interest. "The boy trusts you," he observed. "He has been through terrible things, but he feels safe with you." "This tells me much about your character." Samuel stood up, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "Chief Running Bear, what if there was a way to use these men to help save more children and stop this network permanently? What if their punishment was to help undo the damage they've done?" The chief's eyebrows rose with interest. "Explain what you mean." Samuel looked at the 3 prisoners, his mind working quickly. "Billy has already started talking. Marcus clearly knows the most about the operation. Instead of killing them, what if you forced them to cooperate fully in dismantling the entire network? They could lead you to every location, identify every person involved, and help you rescue every child who's still in captivity." "And after that?" Chief Running Bear asked. "After that, you turn them over to federal authorities with enough evidence to ensure they can never hurt children again. But more importantly, you'll have saved dozens of other children and destroyed the entire criminal network." The idea seemed to intrigue Chief Running Bear, but Samuel could see the skepticism in his eyes. "What makes you think they would cooperate? What's to stop them from lying or leading us into traps?" Samuel looked at Marcus, whose expression had shifted from defiance to calculation. The man was clearly intelligent enough to realize that cooperation might be his only chance of survival. "Because," Samuel said, "they'll know that their lives depend on the success of the mission and the safety of every child who gets rescued. If even one child is harmed because of false information, the deal is off." Chief Running Bear considered Samuel's proposal for several long minutes, occasionally glancing at his warriors and then back at the prisoners. The morning sun was now high in the sky, and Samuel could feel the weight of time pressing on them. Somewhere in the territory, children were still suffering in captivity, and every hour that passed meant more pain for those innocent victims. "Your proposal has merit," the chief finally said, "but it requires trust between our peoples that has been broken many times before. How do we know that once we release these men to federal authorities, they will actually be punished rather than quietly set free?" Samuel had been thinking about this problem himself. The harsh reality was that the federal justice system had failed Native Americans repeatedly, and there was little reason to believe it would work properly in this case either. "What if we don't rely solely on federal authorities?" Samuel suggested. "What if we document everything, gather all the evidence, and make sure the story reaches newspapers in the eastern cities? Public pressure can sometimes accomplish what the courts won't." Marcus suddenly spoke up, his tone desperate. "I'll cooperate fully, I swear it. I'll tell you everything I know about the operation, every location, every person involved. Just don't let them kill me." Chief Running Bear turned his attention to Marcus. "You speak of cooperation now when your life is in danger. Where was this spirit of cooperation when children were begging you for mercy?" "I know I did wrong," Marcus said, though his voice lacked genuine remorse. "But killing me won't change what's already happened. Let me help fix what I can." The 3rd prisoner, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke. "My name is Tom Bradley," he said quietly. "I got involved in this because I needed money for my sick wife's medicine. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I never wanted to hurt those children." Samuel studied Tom's face and saw something different from the other 2 men. Where Marcus showed calculation and Billy showed fear, Tom seemed to carry genuine shame and regret. Perhaps not all of these men were irredeemable. Chief Running Bear called over several of his senior warriors and spoke with them in their native language for several minutes. Samuel could see from their expressions that the discussion was intense, with different opinions being shared and debated. Finally, the chief returned to where Samuel was standing with Little Wolf. "We have decided to try your approach," Chief Running Bear announced, "but with conditions. These men will be kept under constant guard by our warriors. Any attempt to escape or deceive us will result in immediate death. They will lead us to every location where children are being held, and they will identify every person involved in this network. Samuel felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. What happens after the children are rescued? Then we will see if your faith in the white man's justice system is justified, the chief replied. If these men are properly punished and the network is truly destroyed, then perhaps there can be better understanding between our peoples. If not, he left the sentence unfinished. But the implication was clear. Over the next several hours, Samuel watched as Chief Running Bear's warriors organized themselves into an efficient rescue operation. Maps were drawn in the dirt based on information from the prisoners. Distances were calculated and supplies were distributed. The level of organization and tactical planning was impressive, rivaling anything Samuel had seen from military units. Billy, Marcus, and Tom were questioned extensively about every detail of the criminal network. The scope of the operation was even larger than Samuel had initially realized, with connections reaching into 3 territories and involving corrupt officials, unscrupulous business owners, and criminal gangs. The information revealed a systematic exploitation of Native American children that had been operating with virtual impunity. As the war party prepared to depart on their rescue mission, Chief Running Bear approached Samuel one final time. "You have shown wisdom and compassion today, Samuel Hayes. You could have remained silent and let us handle this matter in the traditional way. Instead, you chose to speak for a different path. I just want to see those children safely returned to their families," Samuel replied, "and I want to make sure this never happens again." Chief Running Bear nodded. "Little Wolf has asked to stay with you until we return. His family trusts you to keep him safe, and he feels comfortable here. Will you accept this responsibility?" Samuel looked down at Little Wolf, who was still staying close to his side. The boy had been through terrible trauma, but he seemed to be recovering some of his confidence and spirit. The idea of caring for him while the rescue mission was underway felt both daunting and important. "Of course," Samuel said. "He's welcome to stay as long as he needs to." Chief Running Bear placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder. "When we return, there will be a celebration for the rescued children and a ceremony to honor those who helped save them. You will be welcome at our village as a friend and ally." As the war party departed with their prisoners, Samuel found himself alone with Little Wolf for the first time since the dramatic events of the morning had begun. The boy seemed subdued but no longer fearful, and Samuel realized that the child was probably exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. "Are you hungry?" Samuel asked, and Little Wolf nodded eagerly. As Samuel prepared a simple meal, he reflected on everything that had happened. When he had found a starving child at the trading post just yesterday, he could never have imagined that it would lead to such a complex and significant encounter. The act of simple human kindness had somehow evolved into something much larger, potentially changing the relationship between settlers and Native Americans in the entire territory. Over the next 3 days, Samuel and Little Wolf developed an easy routine. The boy helped with simple chores around the ranch, and Samuel began teaching him more English words. In return, Little Wolf taught Samuel some basic phrases in his native language. Despite the language barrier, they communicated well through gestures, smiles, and shared activities. On the 4th day, the sound of approaching horses announced the return of Chief Running Bear's war party. Samuel and Little Wolf rushed outside to see a remarkable sight. The warriors were returning with over 30 rescued children of various ages, along with several adults who had apparently been held captive as well. The faces of the rescued victims showed exhaustion and trauma, but also relief and joy at being free. Chief Running Bear rode up to Samuel's cabin with the expression of grim satisfaction. "The mission was successful," he reported. "We found the children at both locations, exactly where the prisoners said they would be. We also captured 8 more men involved in the network, and gathered evidence that will help federal authorities prosecute anyone else connected to these crimes." Samuel felt a wave of relief and satisfaction. "What about the 3 prisoners who helped you?" "They kept their word," the chief admitted. "Their information was accurate, and they did not attempt to escape or deceive us. According to our agreement, they will be turned over to federal authorities along with all the evidence we have gathered." As Samuel watched the joyful reunions between rescued children and their families, he realized that something important had changed in the territory. The successful cooperation between the tribe and a white settler had demonstrated that their peoples could work together for common goals. Despite their many differences and past conflicts, Little Wolf ran to embrace his family members who had come with the rescue party, but he kept looking back at Samuel with a mixture of gratitude and affection. The bond that had formed between them during those difficult days was something that would last far beyond this immediate crisis. Chief Running Bear approached Samuel one final time before the tribe departed for their village. "You have proven that there can be trust and cooperation between our peoples," he said. "This will be remembered for generations. You will always be welcome among us as a friend and brother." As Samuel watched the tribe disappear over the horizon with their rescued children, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction and hope. A simple act of kindness toward a starving child had grown into something that might help heal some of the wounds between two very different cultures. The frontier was still a dangerous and difficult place, but perhaps it didn't have to be a place where hatred and violence were the only options for resolving conflicts. Standing alone in front of his cabin, Samuel Hayes realized that his life had been permanently changed by the events of the past few days. He was no longer just a solitary cowboy trying to survive on the frontier. He had become a bridge between two worlds, and that responsibility would shape everything he did from that day forward.